thrilled to be associated with the library to give this talk. I really appreciate Sebastian suggesting that I do it. And what I'm going to talk about tonight is my most favorite aspect of Dwiggins' personality and work. So it's a very fun topic, and I hope you guys will all enjoy this as I go through. I'm essentially just going to talk off the slides. I wish I were there so that I could hear ripples of laughter running through the room as you see different whimsical things that he did. And I wish we could nip round to the pub for a pint afterward, but we'll just flow with what is. And I'm happy to be connecting with everybody on Zoom around the world. So there are, let me go up here and get this activated. I want to particularly thank Adobe for their sponsorship in helping to make this talk happen. Very much appreciated. And although what I'm going to concentrate on during this hour is Dwiggins' humorful side, it's important to remember that he was stricken with very bad diabetes about halfway through his life and never said a bitter word about that. He always woke up every day looking for something fun to do. When he and his assistant Dorothy left his studio at night, he would say, "Good night, dear work," as he left the building. And he just was a delightful human being. But for those of you who aren't familiar with Dwiggins, I wanted to quickly go over the dizzying array of his accomplishments. And I could talk about any of these topics for an hour, and have in many cases talked about them, specialties, for an hour. But he is known best for his typeface design and his graphic design, particularly books. But he was a real innovator in information graphics. He was an accomplished calligrapher, as you'll see. He designed modular ornament, both in metal type and for his own use with stencils that he cut out of celluloid. He was an accomplished illustrator who could channel Pillemont or William Morris, all these different styles from the medieval to the modern. He loved making maps, did that often in his work. He was an accomplished woodcut artist. He was a watercolorist. From age 6 or 7, he started fooling around with wood and was a very good sculptor in wood, and used that later in his work with marionettes and furniture making. He loved writing about things that he cared about, not just graphic design, but sometimes life in general, and tried to have that work published as often as he could. He figured out that satire was much more effective in convincing people to change their ways than scolding or finger wagging. He wrote fiction and fantasy and short stories. He was an accomplished playwright. He was famous in the marionette world, and amusingly enough, many people in the puppet world don't realize that he did anything else. They know him only for his accomplishments with puppetry. And so in that sphere, he was a costume designer. He designed all the lighting for his plays, built the sets. He built much of the furniture in the house where he and Mabel lived. He was a very accomplished flyer and builder of kites. And he built a lot of his own tools in the days before scalpels and X-Acto knives. He took hacksaw blades and fashioned his own knives for cutting his celluloid stencils, for example. So that's just a little bit about him in the larger grounding of who he was. And if you want to know more, one thing you can do, that I'll put a URL at the very end about this, but I run a Twitter account in his name. It's just W.A. Dwiggins. And since 2015, every weekday, I post an image, and he was so prolific. I've been doing it since 2015 with almost no repeats of what he's done. And there's more still to go. I think I have about 9,000 or 10,000 pictures in inventory of all the things that he did. So he grew up in a little town in southeastern Ohio in the Midwest of the United States. This is a drawing that he made in his early 20s of this place. And he was an only child. When he was 7 years old, this is a local newspaper that he created. And if you look, you'll see not only is his lettering pretty accomplished for a 7-year-old, but he has a display ad on the left, a weather report. There's, of course, the banner at the top, a poem. And then when I worked in a newspaper, we had something called wild art, where if we made up a page in linotype slugs and there was a hole somewhere, we could go to AP or UPI and find some little bit to stick in there. And he even has that in the lower right-hand corner. So already at age 7, and then here, probably age 8, he's beginning to work with a pencil, and he has the counterweights and the driving wheels, the injector in the boiler. He's paying attention to everything that's going on in this locomotive at an astonishingly young age, and using a prescription pad blank from his father's medical practice. For his 8th birthday, he was given a plank of clear white pine, 1 by 12 inches by 8 feet long. And he fashioned all of these bits at the top out of that, including stealing thread from his mother's sewing box. He got into trouble for that. The boats at the bottom he carved later as a teenager. But already he's begun working with wood at this young age, and he continued it throughout his life. Here he's playing with some display lettering, end papers of a book of his mother's. And he spent his life making fake documents, and particularly in these days of all the fake news and so on, I find this interesting that he loved making counterfeit documents. So here you have the steamer W.J. Bryan was named after William Jennings Bryan, who was running for the Democratic nomination for president in 1896. And the annex boat A. Sewell refers to Arthur Sewell, Bryan's running mate. And over on the left, you can see an Ohio Senator, Marcus Hanna, who was a supporter of McKinley, who eventually was nominated and elected, signed that. There's a perforated GOP for a grand old party over there on the left. There's a Republican seal, and the ticket's been issued to one of his good friends, Frank Amos, F. Belford Amos. So he's done this at age 16 in this sort of counterfeit mode, and you'll see through the hour other instances of his doing that. More decorative lettering, and I love how prosaic this is. He does all this fancy lettering, and then at the bottom he says laundry over on the right-hand side. So this is age 18. He was very interested in naval architecture and thought for a while he might become a naval architect. But by age 19, he was ready to find his fortune elsewhere, and he decided to travel west to Chicago. And he left his close group of friends. They called themselves the Pretty Tough Gang. And on the left of this picture in the front row is his future bride, Mabel. And the two men in the back row are friends that he kept for his whole life. And Frank Amos on the right was one of the founders of AA, along with Henry Ford and a few other people, but came home to edit the little newspaper in Cambridge, Ohio. So he came back home. Dwiggins didn't. Dwiggins moved to Massachusetts and stayed there for the rest of his life. So he headed off westward on the railroad to Chicago to see what he could do there. And this is his illustration from 1928 of Chicago for a Carl Sandburg book. And Chicago at that time was an astonishing place. In 1850, there were, just 30,000 inhabitants. By 1870, it had grown to 300,000. And by the time Dwiggins got there in 1899, 1.7 million people. So in 50 years, it had grown from 30,000 to 1.7 million. The Great Columbian Exposition of 1893, which is what's shown here, was there. The symphony had started, the Art Institute was there, Frank Lloyd Wright was practicing, Louis Sullivan, Will Bradley, the graphic artist, lived there. It was an astonishing, alive place. And he started going to school in this building, which had originally housed the Art Institute, but when he got there, it was the Frank Holm School of Illustration on one of these floors. And Frank Holm was the foremost sketchbook artist of his day. At a time when there were only newspapers for dissipating information, Holm would go in and make sketches of these famous trials. This one was the Lutgert sausage vat trial, which was all over the US newspapers in the late 1890s. One of the other teachers, there was this great group of faculty. The school only lasted for 3 years. So John McCutcheon, who won a Pulitzer Prize for his cartooning, is showing at the bottom on New Year's 1905, chasing 1904 into the history books. Fred Gowdy was his lettering teacher and became a good friend. Fred gave him a desk in Fred's own studio so that young Will could do commission work on the side outside of his student devoir. And on the right, you see W.W. Denslow, his drawing teacher, who, while Dwiggins was a student, Denslow was making the original pictures for The Wizard of Oz. Also, the Leyendecker brothers. J.C. on the left, this is an illustration for an article written by Theodore Roosevelt. And on the right, FX, the brother, who was very good at chiaroscuro, among other things. And Dwiggins learned so much from these two painting and illustration instructors. So he spent 3 years at the home school, the only 3 years that the school operated, actually. And I won't show you any of his student work, but here's an example of his sense of humor. He was commissioned to do this magazine cover in 1902. Meanwhile, his girlfriend, Mabel Jane Hoyle from the Pretty Tough Gang, had stayed home. And if you look in the tree above the head of the child who's reading, you see MJH initials scratched into the tree trunk. So that was his little I love you signal to Mabel on the cover of this magazine. Here's a Dunning letter. $15 in 1903 is about the equivalent of $540 in US currency now. So it was a significant amount of money for a 23-year-old. And somebody owed him this money. It was E.O. Grover who had hired him to do some design work. So Dwiggins wrote this Dunning letter and sent it to him. And this was the first of many such that he would send out to clients who were late in paying him. He decided in 1903 to go home and see if he could set up a printing press and design outfit in that little 2-story building just beyond the church building. And he was there for about a year, didn't really work. He had some commissions, but he didn't get much traction with things. He did some book plates, and among them are these 3 so-called canting book plates, where there's a play on words made with the book plate owner's name. So there's Hill on the left, Lock in the middle, and then that oak tree on the right. He also delighted in romance stories and faraway places. When he was a kid, he just hoovered up Robert Louis Stevenson stories, the 1001 Nights, the White Company, all these different adventure stories. And throughout his life, especially when he was firmly moored to his house by diabetes, he ranged far and wide in his imagination. So here's a drawing of Camelot, and then related to that, a magazine cover that he did for House Beautiful in 1904. Fred Gowdy moved from Chicago to the little town of Hingham, south of Boston in Massachusetts, and invited Will to come. Will had just married Mabel, so they took off at age 24, moved to Massachusetts, and occupied this house. Through the hour, I'm going to show you each of the places where he worked. So they lived in this little house near a marsh, and Will did his work from there. Gowdy figured out almost immediately that he and Bertha couldn't make a living in Hingham, so they left. But Will and Mabel loved Hingham and Massachusetts, so they stayed there. Here's a illustration that he made for Youth's Companion, and it signals the kinds of things that he was interested in. If you look here at all the things that are mentioned, there's Sherwood Forest in the top center, Camelot just below that, the caravan route to Samarkand in the upper right, Baghdad in the right, Sinbad's house in the upper right, and there'll be more about Sinbad later in my talk, Prester John upper right, Aladdin over on the left edge, Argo, Olympus. He delighted in all of these realms of the imagination that written books could take the reader. And he cranked out, most of his income was from these sentimental broadsides and cards that he did. He was super accomplished at lettering. When you think about this, this is the same time that Rudolf Koch, Rudolf von Larisch, and Edward Johnston are working. It's before 1910. So this is all happening right around the time that Johnston was writing, illuminating, and lettering. Here's another example. This is sheet music for the great Boston printer Daniel Berkeley Updike's Marymount Press. So he's making the drawings and the lettering for these and working essentially as what we would call commercial artist in those days. But aside from his work that he was doing for clients, he's doing this other stuff on the side. Here's another Dunning letter of several pages. Here's the second page. This is sent to the Craftsman's Guild. So now you look at the top, you can see a wheelbarrow full of bags of money going into the Craftsman's Guild shop. But meanwhile, here's Will starving to death outside the greengrocer's, unable to pay his monthly bill. And he did a spoof on his own letterhead drawing that you see on the right with this one. And Grover actually confessed at one point in writing that he would withhold payment until Dwiggins had sent these to him because he knew that Dwiggins would send them. And I think that's unconscionable that Grover would do that, but Will was complicit. So in 1910, he decided he needed to be in town. So he moved into the Graphic Arts District, a place called Cornhill in Boston. And this is not Dwiggins' artwork. This is his great friend, Rudolf Ruzicka, the wood engraver, who made this particular image. He rented space from a guy named Alfred Bartlett, who sold art supplies, sold those sentimental greeting cards and broadsides, and also published a little journal called the Cornhill Booklet. Here's a typical thing that he was doing. This is a soup can with his illustration and lettering. And around this time, his younger cousin, Lawrence Siegfried, son of his mother's sister, younger sister, moved to Boston to go to Harvard. And when he graduated, he and Will started spending a lot of time together. So here they are sitting in the backyard of Will and Mabel's house in Hingham. And Lawrence loved puns, and the two of them just got along great and did all kinds of fun things together, including concocting a German family. Their mothers were from a family of German immigrants earlier in the 19th century who had come. So this pewter pitcher was in the family. And in 1913, they were getting ready for a family party, Thanksgiving or Christmas or something. And they'd been trying to think up the name of a family that they could create all of these fictitious characters for. And Will said to Larry, you know, no matter how hard I try, I can't make the damn pewter shine. And Larry said, okay, that's it. The paterfamilias of this outfit is going to be called Te Dam Pewtershine with an umlaut over the U. So Te Dam Pewtershine is the father, and he has two sons, Hermann and Jakob, who coincidentally are born on the same days as Will and Larry. And they became the alter egos for those two people. And in the case of Hermann Pewtershine and Dwiggins, a lot of the articles that Dwiggins wrote over the years would have that nom de plume of Hermann Pewtershine instead of his signing an article himself. So here are a couple of press marks for the Pewtershine brothers. Their first published work was this for a children's magazine with Larry's verse and Dwiggins' drawings. And you can see the monkeys stealing the M from and the A from the title. And this is the very first time that Hermann Pewtershine is credited as an author. At home in a spare bedroom, they set up what they called the White Elephant Press. He bought several hundred pounds of Caslon type. And you'll see over on the right of Victrola, Dwiggins' mother was a very accomplished musician. And his favorite composer was Satie. He loved Ravel and Debussy also, but Satie his favorite. And it makes great sense to me that that would be his most favorite musical writer. So the very first output of the White Elephant Press was the centennial celebration of Bodoni. He made this drawing based on a medallion that had been cast in Bodoni's honor. And here you see the first press mark for the White Elephant. And in German, that's saying, what am I going to do with this? Here are a couple issues of his landlord's booklet, which are showing his early interest in theatrical things, which took great flower later on, about 15 years from now. Here's a cartoon. George Bernard Shaw apparently plagiarized at one point. And so here are little criticisms of that and the commas in the air that Dwiggins made as a cartoon. This was the time of World War I, and by October, November, it was already in full swing, everybody having declared war in Europe. Dwiggins came from a Quaker background, and he hated war. He didn't understand why people should beat on each other, and we'll see several instances of his commentary about this over the years. But here's this drawing from October of 1914 showing the atrocities of what's going on. In 1915, he moved to the artisanal district of Boston, where you can see that sort of medieval style map up there with the black building showing where he was going to be located. And in the lower left, you see a quotation from Voltaire, from Candide. And this was a recurrent theme for Dwiggins for many, many years. He was, in fact, an ardent gardener on his own. But as I've mused about this, I think you could translate it as we must tend our own garden. But I think his feelings about this is it goes beyond paying attention to your own affairs rather than those of your neighbors. It's that the simple pleasures of daily life in the here and now, in the midst of nature, may bring more happiness than what's been promised to you in the afterlife. And also, if you ignore the big metaphysical questions, as represented by Candide's character Pangloss, and instead focus on situations that you can actually change or improve through your own labors and attentions, you'll do much better. So he produced a whole series of things with this emblem on it over the years. He's still cranking out things. He's now working for furniture stores and jewelers and paper companies, doing both illustrations and lettering. The illustrations would come in the form of a glossy photo, and he'd have to turn the drawing around the same day, send it back to the newspaper for the display ad. But while he's doing that, he can't help doing things on the side. So here's a little bulletin showing the next instance of the white elephant press mark. Here's a woodcut of a freight train on the Central Vermont Railroad going out to visit his friend Carl Rollins. That little chop in the frame, in the mat below the image, is a white elephant. And this is the second press mark. Again, what am I going to do with this? He and Larry also put out a literary journal of their own called The Fabulist. And this had in the first number a short story written by Dwiggins and an explanation of the Putershine family, because this was done by the Putershine brothers. And the genealogy takes 3 pages. It begins in the 15th century with Max Otto Graf von Hinterseelenlich, who was created Baron von Putershine by order of Pope Joan. And then Tedam is born. In 1863, he's publishing works on postprandial metaphysics in Darmstadt. But in 1876, he's run out of town for his radical views, and he moves to Secaucus, New Jersey, Secaucus spelled with umlauts over the vowels. Hermann's born in 1880, Jakob in 1892, and then they form Tedam Putershine's Sons in 1903, as they wrote, abandoning the polemic postprandial vein of Tedam for the more congenial medium of the serio-comic. Here you have an illustration from Dwiggins' short story, which is about the ghosts of French and Belgian soldiers tramping back from the war. This is Voltaire. Again, this is a fireplace screen that he painted for their house in Hingham. And you see this odd gizmo in the upper right. That turns out to be a trolley for kite flying. Dwiggins was a big fan of Malay kites that have no tails. Here he is with Larry. He built these kites and was an expert flyer of them. And here you see that trolley, which he whittled out of wood. And he would load a dozen Chinese fish kites or miniature parachutes into this thing. It had a triangular sail, which I've tried to imitate with that bluish gray triangle on the right. The main kite is already up in the air with a taut kite string. So then they launched this one, carried aloft by that triangular sail. And when the cork bangs into the kite that's way up high in the air, it releases all of these little treasures to float down to the ground. So again, a kind of pleasure in doing theatrical things. His niece, Eleanor, who was a particular favorite, lived in Philadelphia and taught Latin at a private school there. So he and Mabel made this rug for her. It's about 2 by 3 feet. And Dwiggins designed it, and then Mabel hooked it. This is in the collection at the Boston Public Library, along with that kite trolley, the fireplace screen. A lot of the things that I'm showing you tonight, you can see on request if you go to the Boston Public Library, which holds all of his papers. Here's a lamp that he made for the house with a construction paper cutout. He designed and built most of the furniture in their house. Here's a mural for the dining room wall. This was in color, but there's only a black and white capture of it, so we can't see what colors he used. This is Sinbad's home port. And again, he thought of Sinbad adventuring off here and there while he stayed put at his house in Hingham. He was a particular fan of the fantasy writing of the Irish author Lord Dunsany. And in the first issue of The Fabulist, they made a notice in the back saying, all submissions for being reprinted to The Fabulist must be accompanied by payment, except submissions from Lord Dunsany. Those will be printed for free. And they sent a copy to Lord Dunsany, who of course then sent something to them, and that showed up in the second issue. But here is this god, Mana Yud Sushai, who had a bunch of creator gods as lieutenants underneath him. And he had to be kept asleep by this drummer. If he ever woke up when the drummer stopped, he would do away with all the creator gods. So the creator gods employed this drummer to keep Mana Yud Sushai asleep. And I heard that Dwiggins had painted something in their living room, never had any sign of what it was. He took this and painted it in extremely low contrast ochre on the wall, so that it was almost impossible to see when you came in the room. But in fact, it's that illustration there on the wall. He also designed a weather vane for the roof of the house that was made out of, it's a life-size codfish, 5 feet long, made out of copper, and with this shop drawing to guide the artisan who made it. And there was a readout in the living room with 20 lamps to indicate the wind direction on the compass points, the little compass rose in the living room, so they knew how the wind was blowing right from the comfort of the living room. He and some editor friends, this is the period now of Dada in Europe and in New York, put together this bizarre little, this is the only issue that they ever made, but it's number 7 of something called Vague or Vague, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And it was deliberately printed and bound askew and is full of typographical errors and sloppinesses made by these people who were extremely fastidious in their professional work. And it shows the, again, the artwork of Hermann Peterschein there at the top. And here's a display ad. I love that the sole agent is Adrien Huff de Guff. He also used the cartoons to do non-funny things. These both appeared in the Boston newspapers in 1914 and 1915. And he began publishing articles, sometimes under his own name, sometimes with Hermann Peterschein. The one on the left has to do with the similarities with the design of printer's ornament and music notation. And he once said, ornament is a music of space. I love that sentence. The other article has to do with grace in letter forms and how to achieve that. Hermann wrote an article about how all the best artists seem to be working now for advertising clients rather than for editorial. And they did, he shows the work of 4 different artists, T.M. Cleland, Walter Dorwin Teague, Dwiggins, and Fred Gowdy. So this is the one for Cleland. And if you look at the details in it. I'm going to read to you now the caption for this. Mr. T.M. Cleland is inspired by Roman formulae and by their renaissance in the work of Bodoni to the achievement of some of the most stylistic designs in the history of advertising. He's notably successful in the infliction of an austere restraint upon both himself and his client. The above design for a spring catalog cover was taken from a 4th century Sicilian cookbook in the artist's library. And he goes on to say the lettering might have been done by Mr. Bruce Rogers as a special favor, but unfortunately, Mr. Rogers does not do commercial work. And now look at the date in which the company was established. He then goes on to Walter Darwin Teague. Mr. Teague forms his style upon a formula derived from the French engravers of the 18th century. The ornamental properties of this period have qualities of great distinction, and Mr. Teague employs them in a distinguished manner. I've chosen this design from an astonishing wealth of material because it shows the artist's facility of adaptation, but particularly because it's an excellent example of how an ornamental border may be used around an advertisement to focus attention upon the thing advertised. And at the bottom, Walter Darwin Teague signs this as WD, because of course Will did all these drawings. Then here's a cigarette ad made by Dwiggins. And here's one lampooning Gaudi. The caption isn't very funny for this one, so I'm gonna, in the interest of time, I'm gonna skip over it. Here's issue 2 of the Fabulist, illustrations done by stencil for Lord Dunsany's story, which was called East West. So here's a Thomas Eakins painting from 1889. Dwiggins joined the Society of Printers in Boston in 1908. It was formed in 1905. It's still going. I'm proud to say I'm a member. And there was a notice sent out for a meeting in 1917 that Dwiggins did. And all the people, Dwiggins is in this picture in the foreground in the center, but everybody illustrated here was an important printer or binder or illustrator in the Boston printing scene of those days. And again, signed by Hermann Peterschein. He moved to the downtown retail district in 1918 and had 2 roommates, his cousin Larry Siegfried and John Goss, and Dwiggins would play chess simultaneously with both roommates and win both games over and over again. He began to experiment a lot with woodblock, with woodcuts. That sharpening stone case is something that he carved himself, made a lot of his own tools for these things. And here he was commuting by train from Hingham into Boston, about 45 minutes each way every day. And he started writing fantasy stories about a place called Athalincia that might be Persia 1,000 years ago, or Uzbekistan in the 19th century, who knows? But he wrote all these stories for a period of about 15 years. And this is an illustration of an embassy going to visit the Bega in Ageb. He and Larry published this in 1919 to criticize the Boston publishers, saying that they just weren't doing a good enough job with quality control and manufacturing. Here's a chart showing how the quality has plunged. This, of course, is all done by hand. And there were fake interviews included with this, things like, Mr. B, will you tell the committee why you printed this book on cardboard? Well, to make it the right thickness. It had to be 1 inch thick. Why that thick particularly? Because otherwise it would not sell. If a book isn't 1 inch thick, it won't sell. You mean to say the people who buy books select them with the help of a foot rule? Well, they have to have some standard of selection. So the booklet goes on with all these fake interviews. And after it was published, Dwiggins got a call from one of the Boston publishing executives demanding that he divulge the name of the employee who had consented to an interview in that thing. Here's another one from around that same period, when this was the time of Hambidge's dynamic symmetry and Singleton's the golden section and the golden pentagon. And he's saying that an average person with no art background can simply follow the rule of the purple sexagon and make a perfect newspaper page. Here's another illustration from that. An Anatolian milk ticket is what they're printing here. So number 3 of the Fabulous came out in 1921. You can see this repetitive motif of the archer began in 1914 when that TSTL represents the sky's the limit. And here is his lettering. This is his philosophy, life philosophy, which I hope I'll have time to read, but I doubt that I will. So I'll send an image of it to Becky, and you can look back on the St. Bride website later to read this. It's a beautiful encapsulation of what he felt was important in life. This is all the pages of this John French Wilson poem, also lettered by hand. You can see 10 years before the time that he was going to become an accomplished type designer for Linotype. John Goss, his roommate, wanted him to join the Boston Watercolor Society. You had to submit 2 paintings for that. So this one is Dwiggins did and is called The Incandescent Cheese. And you'll see on the wall hanging at the back, or perhaps that's wallpaper, those pagodas and willow trees, those were all made with gouache and wooden stamps. And we'll see those again in a minute. He moved to Fenway Studios. At this point, this building had just been made to mimic the Atelier in Paris where painters worked, all Northlight studios. He set up the Society of Calligraphers, which was entirely fictitious, and he picked what people should be honorary members and sent them. This particular certificate was sent to Fred Gowdy. And you can see at the top of this is Kobo Daishi, a real person in medieval Japan. But in Dwiggins' picture, he's standing on one side of a swollen stream and his followers are holding up a scroll where the characters appear on the opposite shore. This is printed in pochoir stenciled in 10 colors. He published a lot of things about book design here, his own illustration and the mixing of sans serif and Roman types. He's talking about how you should think about the nature of the illustrations that accompany narrative. Here are his wooden stamps. That's a painter, neighbor of his in the Fenway studio, C.H. Pepper. That's an announcement for one of his shows that Dwiggins did. So that entire landscape was made up of discharges from those stamps on the right. The Society of Printers put out all these wonderful color prints in a portfolio, all done by stencil. His Sinbad's visit to the Congo was printed in 22 colors on the left. And he also goes to La Paz on the right. And here's Sinbad's home port, a newer mural made for the dining room in Hingham. And this has been on display in the Boston Public Library. I'm not sure it's going to be visible to the public again after their renovations are completed. He made all of his own furniture for the house, as I said. That's a bulletin board on the left with this wonderful bas-relief naturalistic sculpture. These are knobs for a sideboard in the dining room. And Gress, who was editor of American Printer, and Dwiggins played back and forth with the idea, well, wait a minute, who is this Hermann Püterschein? Maybe Dwiggins is the fictitious person and Püterschein is the real person. He shows a photograph, Gress shows a photograph of Dwiggins here on the left to Fred Gowdy, known to be Dwiggins' friend, and Gowdy says, I've never seen that person before. So they demand a printing sample from Hermann Püterschein on the right, handwriting. And then they ask for their thumbprints and signatures. And when the thumbprints are blown up 27 times, you can see Dwiggins' thumbprint detail on the left and Püterschein on the left and Dwiggins on the right. Püterschein publishes these short stories, which of course are really Dwiggins, with these fabulous stencil decorations by Dwiggins. So in the course of just a few years, using his own homemade knives and celluloid, he came up with this elaborate system. He had a wallet on his drawing board of all these different shapes that he could pull out. And of course, the beauty of the celluloid is you can flip it over and have a reverse image, which with the wooden stamps you couldn't do. He then moved downstairs. Goss left to form the graphic design department at the Rhode Island School of Design. So Dwiggins moved downstairs. The current occupant was gracious enough to let me photograph this. And shortly after, the AIGA gave Dwiggins their gold medal. And as he walked up to receive the gold medal, this voice rang out from the back of the room, and it was Carl Rollins dressed up as Futureshine saying, "Wait a minute, he stole all my best ideas. I demand to have equal time." So he walked up to the front and was mollified with a gold key to New York City that you can see pinned onto his breast. And this is I'm getting behind in my notes here. This is a sophisticated flower making the welcoming address at a Kiwanis convention. Here's another Hermann Futureshine stencil piece. So Hermann keeps going through the years. In 1932, Dwiggins wanted to issue something critical of the design of the American paper money, saying that other countries had much nicer currency than they did. So he got the Limited Editions Club to print this up by subscription. It wasn't a regular LEC title, but Dwiggins wrote this, and remember this is 1932. So he's saying in 1951, first phase of the Communist Revolution, artists are destroying the Bureau of Engraving and Printing because they're so furious at how ugly the money is. And he asks, we have all these beautiful fives available to us. Why do we have to use the one that's on the money? And rather than just criticizing what the government is doing, he binds into the book this 5-crown note, front side, rear side, showing how it could be done. And there are postage stamps, tobacco franking stamps, all kinds of other designs accompanying that for this fictitious country called the Antipodes. Then he moves in 1933, during the depths of the Depression, back home, where he can take better control of his diabetes. And in this garage behind their house, he sets up not only his graphic design workshop, but also a marionette theater. And this theater began in 1931, and he continued with this through World War II. Here's the proscenium with his patented, what he called faded bright colors. And if you look back here, you can see a stove on the left and an ottoman on the right, and those curtains stashed away. Here is a color proof on the left of what was used to stencil the fabric for the curtains and the ottoman. And on the right, the stove that kept him warm in the winter, he referred to as Tweedledum and Tweedledee because it had 2 pipes going up to the heat exchanger. Here's an example of his set design. This is from a pirate play, sort of think Treasure Island roughly, Cornwall in the 1800s. And this is about 10 inches deep, 3.5 feet wide for the marionette plays that he put on. He loved marionettes. And for him, this was the confluence of writing, theater, wood carving, music, dialogue, all together in one place. And when at the end of the play, people would say, "Author, author," he would get up, because he always sat in the audience. He'd walk backstage, and then this little 12-inch marionette would come out and take a bow on the proscenium stage. Here he is with his co-author of that first play, MIT English professor named Bill Crosby. Around the same time, he was writing these things for the Saturday Review with William Rose Benet. He would send Benet a design with a caption, and Benet would then pen 4 lines of verse to go with it. Later, these were taken up by Linotype when his typeface Electra was released. These were printed in that booklet, type ornament with landscape attached. And here you can see 2 more. See that Albrecht Dürer chop at the top of the left-hand red illustration? Well, when you look at it carefully, it's WAD. Here's one of his Atalanta stories published in 1935 with his own half-uncial calligraphy, which he later made into a typeface. A title page from 1936. That illustration is made entirely from printer's ornaments, and the crow's nest is an upside down beehive. Bruce Rogers' personal insignia printer's mark. Hermann Petershine said that his African friend Mwana Masasi had a zinc case in which he kept his most personal possessions. And in it was a Bruce Rogers book, which even protected in that case, it turned out the press mark looked like this. This was done for a book that the Typophiles published in 1935 to celebrate Bruce Rogers. Around that same time, they did another book about the ampersand, and this one shows Fred Gowdy being featured, and all of these delightful puns, printer's puns. In 1936, he did a special edition with Melbert Carey for the Press of the Woolly Whale of an H.G. Wells story called Treasure of the Forest. These are all hand-painted pochoir illustrations in every copy of the book, not mechanically produced. And it was all the rage in those days for limited editions to be signed by the artist and the author. Well, they did an over-the-top lampooning of this, so that what you see here is there's the press mark of Woolly Whale. Then on the left, you've got Mwana Masasi, made up by Dwiggins, an African artist who was specialized in color theory, with Athena's serpent as part of his signature. Then Hermann Petershine, then Dwiggins. On the right, you see Van Vechten and Carey, who were the real comp and publisher, but also there's B. Poilu. Well, the word in French for whale is baleine, and poilu means furry or hairy. And Balaena lanigera are the zoological names for whale and chinchilla. So I loved this, that they did this, and it was not mentioned anywhere. These two people, Poilu and Lanigera, are not mentioned anywhere. When my book was published in 2018, the deluxe edition had a letterpress portfolio of Dwiggins' writings, which you can see in that reddish folder there. So we did the same thing on the colophon page. Over on the right, you can see Michael Babcock, who's present today. Hi, Michael. Andrew Steves, they both did the linotype composition. Daryl Hyder printed these, and Rob Saunders, publisher. But I forged Mwana Masasi's and Hermann Petershine's signatures, and then made up an entirely new person with the help of a Latin scholar. Albus for white, Fabricius for maker, and Atratinus was a Roman senator and consul who was famous for always wearing black. And Dwiggins referred to himself as a black and white smith. So I put that in there. And again, except for the occasional public utterance of it in a place like today, it's not written down anywhere. The Typophiles sent him a birthday card in 1937, and they got the date wrong because his birthday is actually in June. So he consulted with his niece, the Latin scholar, and then lettered this and sent it to them, begging permission to retain the birthday greetings from April until June the 19th. Written at Little Hingham on April 5th, 1937, signed William, son of Dwiggins. He designed this building and moved into it in 1937, design studio upstairs, Marionette Theater downstairs. It was built on the site of a livery stable where there was a steep drop off at the back, and underneath was a pigsty. So in the lower level where the Marionette Theater was located, Dwiggins carved these runes saying, "Here Dwigs following pigs." The theater could take up to 70 people standing room only. It had enough room for live music. He felt that reed organ or a couple people playing clarinet or violin greatly added to the festivities of the plays. Here's the second proscenium. At the top, you can see carved with a knife blade the portrait of Ho Tai, who's the Chinese god of good times and small children. And when the house lights went down, that's what it looked like. Here are just a few of the marionettes that Dwiggins made. And as I say, he's much celebrated in the puppet world. He's still in the curriculum at the University of Connecticut, which is the place in the world to go if you want to study puppetry. This was printed by line cut, the black, from his calligraphy, and then hand stenciled in 3 colors and given out to the neighbors who came to these performances. I sure wish I'd seen one of those performances. Oh, they were made basically just for the neighborhood to enjoy and for the Dwiggins' friends. This is Marina, a dancer who was particularly adept at moving, and she's cast plaster. She's the only one not made from carved wood. And here's a private moment in the green room with Dwiggins and Marina. 3 more futuristic puppets, Ice Demon, Metal Demon, and a dancer on the right called Aluminia. That's aluminum foil over cardstock. But he could also do naturalistic sculpture like this. This is Lilith, the puppet. And he wrote a book, which was published by Puppetry Imprints in Detroit, about how to do all this, entirely hand-lettered. He was a costume designer. Other members of the troupe would actually make the costumes. He made the marionettes. He would imagine the sets and then build them. Here he is, director, giving notes to the cast. And the script would sometimes be printed up in book form. There's Brother Jeremy, the puppet, holding the script for his play. And here you can see players acting down the strings, performing Brother Jeremy. Here's a very detailed lighting diagram. And you can see on the right that the electrical panel is worthy of a small community theater. This was just done in his own backyard. The special effects he made too. On the right, that drum is clad in pine and bamboo strips, and there are a length of cotton and a length of silk, so that if you hold that taut with the handle at the bottom and then spin the drum, it will make a noise. The one on the right rotates simply by the heat of the incandescent lamp and creates flickering firelight. Here's an apology poster backstage that people weren't to apologize, that a fine would be levied every time they apologize for a mistake, saying it's astonishing how important it is to know what the strings are for. He and his friend Arthur Rushmore, on the 500th of Gutenberg, made this fake document that was Mrs. Gutenberg's journal. And basically, Johann goes off to the scriptorium and is feckless and unable to do anything for himself. She's the one who invents movable type and printing, but she lets him take all the credit. And that's a book they made called The Mainz Diary. It was published in 1940. Here's another woolly whale publication on how businessmen, square businessmen, should work with artists, because they're a species that they can't understand at all. So the topics are, what is an artist? Do artists think? How to choose an artist? How to flatter an artist? How to pay an artist? And even though it was very tongue-in-cheek, there were a lot of important points made in this. Here's the mark for all of his friends in the Book Builders of Boston. All the employees of the publishing companies banded together and made an organization which has an annual award in Dwiggins' name given every year. During World War II, he produced this booklet saying basically, we live in this tiny little planet. Why are we beating each other up? We should be taking care of each other and cooperating. We shouldn't be fighting. Instead, we're smashing the water butts, and some people are taking what they want and leaving others for dead. You know, how are we going to get over this? What are we going to do? And in the end, he says, we have to form an entirely new mental picture of the world's population. All of us together on Earth as a single community, all sharing the same needs, the same dangers, the same fate, the same hope. We must figure ourselves as part of the crew of a very small ship on a hazardous voyage across unknown seas. Should be sent to everybody in government right now, I think. Typical envelopes that he would send out to people made with stencils. And a wonderful assistant, Dorothy Abbey, showed up in the last 10 years of his life and helped him with printing projects. And I'm just going to show you a few of these. He wanted the Athelinthia stories to be published all in one gathered volume in the 1920s, but that never happened. So they issued one in 1948, The War Against Wak, which shows, here's an example from that, this naval battle that takes place on a river, stencil illustration. And another one in 1950, The Glistening Hill. and fragment of a third one, Ronabegia, but those were the only of the 11 stories, those were the only ones ever published. So here's the dummy from 1928 with his, was full of material, content, all designed. And I thought 100 years later, why can't we make this happen? So later this spring, I'm actually going to run a crowdfunded campaign reproducing all of his stories in the format that he designed in the 1920s, same trim size, using his Caledonia type. And I hope either by getting in touch with me, Becky's going to give you my website particulars, and you can also sign up for, on Twitter, I run this account called W.A. Dwiggins. You can find out about it there. But I'm hoping enough of us can band together to produce this so that his dream from 1928 can come true. And I want to close by reading an account of his work methods that we have through Paul Hollister. You take a cork out of the top of your head and you drop in a word like La Paz or Congo or Sinbad, one word at a time. If it's the name of a place, it need not be a place you know. If it's not the name of a place, but just a word, you need not know it so fine as to split hairs. Just put the word in. Then put in a couple of cocktails and some black coffee and put the cork back in tight and jump up and down for 2 or 3 days. And then the word will come out of your fingers onto the paper. Then you give the result, picture or pattern or whatever it is, a high sounding caption like graphic response to verbal stimulus, La Paz. That's all there is to it. It doesn't mean a thing, but it's a lot of fun. So, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bruce. That has just left me smiling. And I am sure that if we were in St. Bride, sadly we can't be, the room would be full of rapturous applause and lots of happy faces too. It's just such an amazing body of work. And I know you've only probably covered 0.5% of it in this evening's lecture. That was absolutely brilliant. Thank you. We have got lots of time for questions, and a few have come through on private messages. So if anyone does have any questions you'd like to ask Bruce, then please do put them in the chat. I can start off with a couple from Courtney, who's been messaging me about them. So it's quite a good one actually to start with. Courtney has said, this is a really fantastic presentation. Thank you. Bruce clearly is so passionate about Will's life and work. My curiosity begs the following question. How did Bruce first come to know Dwiggins, and how has he developed his knowledge of the topic?
So I was telling Becky about this before the lecture. I discovered his work when I moved to Boston in 1923, when I was 23 years old. And the Boston Public Library had a very large collection of graphic arts books. And at that moment, the Dwiggins' assistant was setting up the, it's not showing my face, Becky.
Oh, sorry, I pressed a button by mistake. Can you start your video again? Sorry, Bruce, that was me.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
There we go.
There we go, sorry, so, thank you.
I met Dwiggins' assistant, Dorothy, who was setting up these 3 rooms in the BPL of all of his stuff. And I went home to see my parents and said, I've discovered the work of this amazing, fun, brilliant guy. And they said, yeah, you lived around the corner from him when you were a baby. And it turns out the first 5 months of my life, I lived a couple of blocks away from Dwiggins in Hingham before my family moved up to the woods in New Hampshire. So I began collecting his work then in my early 20s. And in those days, it was still fairly common and affordable for somebody with a small purse. And I just kept going with that. And then the book builders, when I was 30, asked me to give a lecture about him. And I went on from there. And in 2003, I was complaining to my great friend, Rocky Steinauer, that there wasn't a biography of Dwiggins. And he said, well, you should do it. And I said, no, somebody much more august than I needs to do it. And he said, no, you love Dwiggins, you should do it. So I spent 15 years researching his work at the Boston Public Library and at Yale and at the SD Warren Archive, various other places, and eventually was able to publish my book through Letterform Archive.
That's great. Do you also, another question from Courtney, which is a really interesting one. Can you tell us anything about his home or personal life and what it was like?
He was very private. He was warm and much beloved by his good friends. His marionette troupe was full of really colorful and interesting people, including Henry Beston, the naturalist, who wrote a book called The Outermost House that we in the States know well, and Henry's wife, Elizabeth Coatsworth, who was a noted children's book author. So he had good friends with whom he spent time and loved reading aloud. Winnie the Pooh in particular, he loved to read aloud, and he loved music. But because of diabetes, he didn't go out much. In fact, in 1937, when the AIGA ran a big show of his in New York, Mabel went to represent them, but Bill stayed home. He didn't like to circulate in public. So he had this puckish, devilish sense of humor, loved reading and visual arts, and pretty much was a homebody, just stayed there.
That's great, thank you. I was just wondering, is there anything that Dwiggins couldn't do or turn his hand to? Because he seems to be able to do pretty much anything. Is there any evidence of things that he tried and failed at in a good way, like experimentation?
No.
Or
No, other than, for instance, I wish that Mylar had existed when he was working. It would have been harder to cut, but the celluloid stencils that he made in the 20s and 30s have all fallen to pieces because they dried out. And he tried acetate, but it was hygroscopic and changed dimension as a result, so he couldn't use it. But I don't know of anything that he tried his hand at that he couldn't succeed at. And I loved how he could do illustrations through this wide range, from Piranesi to Piedmont to medieval. He could do all those things.
yeah, he's such an incredibly talented man. Yeah, it's just absolutely brilliant. And do any films exist of his marionette plays at all, or was that nothing?
No,
Sadly, just
nothing.
photographs. Okay.
Just photographs.
And we've just had a comment from Simon Loxley, who's the editor and designer of the St. Bride journal, Ultrabold. And he said, that was fantastic, Bruce. You'd search hard for any modernism, I suppose, but I find this period of American graphics absolutely fascinating. Did Dwiggins have any sort of dabbling in modernism, or was that very much not his thing?
I think one of the reasons for his obscurity now is that he was an ornamentalist and continued in that vein throughout his life. And when we veered very much toward the modern and the influence of Swiss design and so forth, he was forgotten and thought of as cobwebby and old-fashioned. But there are actually examples of modern books that he did. Let me see if I can very quickly find one here to show you. This is a math book.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think everyone can see that. Oh yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, that's great, thank you. We've had another, not a question, but more of an observation from Simon. And he says, you can find this kind of whimsical, self-depreciating humour in the typophile's predecessor group, the Stowaways based in New York from early 20th century to the 30s, of whom Gaudi and Rogers were members. So, yeah, apparently, so that's great. And we've had a question from, or comment from Elizabeth Gardner, and she says, how can we not fall in love with W.A. Dwiggins? Your work, Bruce, in sharing this, the absolute delight he took in how he lived his life, his connections and his work is amazing and much appreciated, especially for the way you bring us right back to that space of delight in our lives. Truly inspirational, moving. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have to go to tend to Basho, so he's barking up a storm. So I assume that's her dog. So thank you. Does anyone have any other questions to ask Bruce? Is there a question, Bruce, that you wish you were always asked about Dwiggins, but no one ever asks?
I think only this ongoing mystery of why a person of this immense accomplishment has been so forgotten in most graphic design curricula. And I'm sure that people at Reading know about him right from jump, but it's just fascinating to me that somebody who was so much in the public eye in his accomplishments 50 or 60 years ago is just not noticed now. And so that was my real goal in putting this book together. This was my labor of love, my gift to him, so that he could be, the image I have is that he never liked the spotlight in the way that, say, Fred Gowdy loved being in the spotlight. And I have now gone into the wings and have grabbed Dwiggins by the elbow and tugged him out onto the stage so that he's in the spotlight again. That was really my mission in doing that.
That's great, thank you. And there's a comment from Fernando who's slightly aghast at the overpriced shipping of your book from the US. Are there any plans to make it more available or more easily worldwide, or is that the only way of getting your book at the moment?
Here's what I would say. The last time that I sent a book to Belgium, it cost $105 to send it. And if people who live near each other could band together and get in touch with me, I have a few books here. I don't know if Letterform Archive would do the same thing, but if 2 or 3 people wanted to have me send a book box to them, we could then go splitsies on the shipping among 2 or 3 orders, and it would be less expensive. Or if you know somebody who's traveling to the States, I could ship a book to a local US address, and then the book could be hand carried to you back to wherever you live.
Brilliant problem solving. I think at the moment that's how it will be. Thank you. And I'm just going to put a last call out for any other further questions from anyone in the audience. But in the meantime, if anything else does come up, I know, Bruce, you had one more thing that you'd like to mention about Dwiggins, which I think is a nice end point. But if anyone does think of any other questions, we can come back to them, but I'll just hand back over to Bruce for a moment.
Okay. In 1921, when he published the 3rd issue of The Fabulist, he wrote what I think is an absolutely beautiful expression of what he cared about in life. So he's 41 years old. He's starting to contend with his diabetes. He's at full flower in his commercial career. And here's what he says. And meanwhile, he's writing these Atalanta stories at the same time. Myself, I hope to live in a land that I have made out of potsherds and broken bits. It's not a well-articulated country, and it's not different from a many that other people have made. There are old things in it, but it's not old. I managed to have arched masonry dug out of Rome and Greek fragments of marble, but the colonists from Greece have forgotten their fatherland and pasture their cattle under the columns. There are glints from the east in the land if there are really no Easterners there. I use words to furnish this part of the country, Samarkand and Isfahan. They do as much as real colonists would, and much more musically. I do not need real things in this part. I choose, rather, invocations of memories or imaginings. All the claptrap of Oriental imagery serves me very well. Dust and sun and faded bright colors. There are no cities, and there are only the more picturesque sorts of merchants. How the inhabitants live, I'm not too much inclined to ask, being over close to the problem myself in this part of the world. But they're mostly countrymen and work in the soil. You will see that the country is hopelessly romantic. Hopelessly to you, I mean. For a time back, I was ashamed of its nearness to ruined Rome and hid its existence. Now I've grown careless about your opinions and am inclined to live in whatever land I please.
That is a perfect way to end this evening. Thank you so much, Bruce. Excuse me. Sorry, choking there with admiration, of course. I think there's just been a couple more comments about how brilliant tonight has been, and I couldn't agree more. It's just been a wonderful evening and insight into this incredible man's work, and you have just delivered a brilliant talk. I could hear you talk all night, to be honest. You've got such a lovely soothing voice. It's brilliant. But thank you so much for giving your time so generously to do this talk for us. And I'd just like to say another huge thank you to Adobe for sponsoring this evening, and to the Wink Underwear Charitable Trust as well. And thank you so much to everyone else who came along this evening, and we hope you've all enjoyed it as much as we have. So thank you very much. I think that's everything. And I know do follow Bruce on Twitter, and I'll be looking forward to seeing more details of the Kickstarter campaign for the novels and things coming soon. So that's brilliant. Thank you all very, very much.